Hello, my name is Saksham Verma. I am a freshman computer engineering major at UMass Amherst, and this is my friend.
I'm Adam. I'm a second year undergraduate at Boston College, working as a research fellow with the Harvard Visual Computing Group and Harvard Medical School in neuroscience and connectomics.
And today, he and I are going to be talking about a group that contributes the least to one of the biggest issues in the world, which is how infants and expecting mothers are affected by climate change, where I have seen that according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, climate-related health issues are on a massive rise, especially in infants and expecting mothers, where according to the Journal of Global Health, maternal exposure to pollutants like PM2.5 or nitrogen dioxide during pregnancy is linked to many complications in maternals and newborns, especially with risks being preterm birth, low birth weight, stillbirth, and much more. And these findings are also further emphasized by the World Health Organization, which shows how infants' vulnerability begins in the utero and extends well into early development due to physiological and immunological maturity in children, for babies, I guess. Yeah. What do you think?
I think there's an interesting analogy to be made there between, let's just say, the well-known effects of smoking on prenatal effects and newborn conditions, and those of the air pollutants you're talking about from climate change. I think most people, when hearing it phrased as the former, have the alarm bells on their head sounded off, ring, ring, ring. But if it's the
Yes.
latter, because of how gradual climate change is, how long it's been in the public conscience without, frankly, without universal disdain for it, I feel like people are a lot more tame to it, strangely enough. Have you found anything in your research towards like public perception or awareness towards it? Or
So when I was researching into this topic, I found a hospital or like a medical college. I'm probably gonna pronounce this wrong. We'll see. Dhanalakshmi Shivanshana Medical College Hospital. Okay, it's both medical college and hospital. This college hospital did a cross-sectional study on the growing awareness of climate change in in areas like India, and it says that like connect the connection to health of climate change, and the connection of climate change to health, especially when like maternal and child health, is extremely poorly understood. And since this is poorly understood, I can see this as like a gap of awareness that could be considerably dangerous. Where if people don't understand the situation, probably communities are less likely to advocate from the government or any organization that helps with climate change to give responses addressing these issues. So like that's what I found, and I found more, but I'll get into that a little bit later.
sure, yeah. I mean, with that awareness note, it reminds me actually quite strongly of the geopolitical handling of, let's just say, microplastics. Are you familiar with what microplastics are?
Somewhat, yes. I
Okay,
am
so
somewhat familiar with
just for
Renaissance.
the audience, let's just say with your everyday plastic bottles, plastic containers and such, when using them for, let's just say, foodstuffs containing things, sometimes they shed small little plastic particles known as microplastics. Now, these microplastics, once they get into living tissue, can act as potent endocrine disruptors. Now, over the past couple of years, there have been many, many studies finding microplastics in human tissue and finding that, or at least theorizing that they can act as potent endocrine disruptors, which cascades down to things like, as you're talking about, uh, bad conditions in newborns, effects on reproductive health, let's just say with testosterone or estrogen levels being affected, what have you. And I feel like it's an interesting case there where public awareness isn't quite at the point to act on it, where even if people on the individual level are trying to minimize their use of or intake of microplastics, it's not very effectual because we need change at the government scale to eliminate the use of those plastic products or at least regulate it there. So I think it's a similar case where we have a consequence of human action that gravely affects the future of the human race, but it's very bottlenecked by the government there. What are your thoughts on the current condition of, let's just say, geopolitical leaders acting on climate change, especially when we know quantitatively that it affects some of these very vulnerable groups, like expecting mothers and newborns. What do you think is the main blocker there?
First, I think the main blocker is just how much people they're just arguing or sitting in a room and are just talking about these issues, trying to make something happen. But on top of that, since they're arguing for so long, most of the time it's just nothing happens at all and no policies go into effect, which is actually a really big cause for concern with how gradually uh climate how the climate change is affecting our planet gradually, and especially in current times where the weather over the past year has been very random, which also concerns me personally. We've seen that it snowed in like what, November or early something like that, early this year. But on top of that, it also on top of that, not only is it just like the government helping themselves, it's also just that since these guys aren't coming up with any policies, areas like India, where a lot of India still faces challenges of poverty and also high population density, can result in issues with access to public health care, which is also a bit of a concern or a major concern since if public healthcare access is limited, not everyone is able to feel well or do what things that they normally do. Plus, it just increases the risks of diseases and other things being more widespread than they already are. What do you think?
I think that a lot of this, and I mean, my personal opinion on why we're not seeing this change is because governments, even in the free democratic world, are starting to less and less reflect the will and desires of the upcoming generations of their constituents. So I feel like there's a large gap between most governments prioritizing the interests of legacy generations, which aren't necessarily affected as gravely by these issues. Let's just say they've already had a child, so they're not as fazed by the news that it affects like expecting mothers, newborns, etc. And the interests of,
Right.
let's just say, younger generations who would be very much affected like that, and how our governments tend to follow the will of those older generations. Older generations tend to vote in at much higher rates worldwide.
Right.
So I feel like that dissonance there is one of, if not the biggest reasons that we really aren't seeing change towards those issues nowadays. I feel like another factor might also be around like Citizens United, with corporate interests bleeding into attempts at political change. Corporations, by nature, for at least for the purposes of profits, mostly do not want to support climate change regulations. These regulations lower the profits, albeit with the massive benefit to society of reducing climate change associated emissions. So I think in order to get world governments to act effectually towards climate change, we need to resolve that dissonance between the interests of policymakers aligning with corporate and legacy interests versus the interests of the majority of their constituents.
Right. So like what you're trying to say is that like we need to focus more on everyone being somewhat connected into these issues, like thinking more in the long term as well, I guess, somewhat.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's a way to go about it. I feel like a lot of these legacy generations, if we can adequately make them aware of the consequences of these issues, it becomes less of a problem. That dissonance,
Right.
although still targeted adversely to a group which doesn't necessarily reflect the demographics of the nation,
Not
still
right now, at
reflects
least.
beliefs of those constituents because they're made adequately aware of the issues. So that's a great solution you're proposing. I feel like it's just very hard to enact that on a large scale because of how they need to slot into the existing beliefs of some of these constituents.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is gonna be hard to enact on a large scale, but on top of that, if you think about it, any type of change is always hard at first, and it's always better to start somewhere, even on if it's a small scale. It's better to start on a small scale or somewhere so that it gets easier to move into as we go along with time. Like right now, even though yes, there are people being affected by this, like the climate change gradually getting worse each year, these infants and children and infants and pregnant women will all be more affected as time goes on. Plus, on top of that, I found a study saying that by the Journal of Adolescent Health, where research argued that adolescents and young adults in resource-limited environments are also less able to recover from the climate shocks of climate change due to uh, due to this limited access of healthcare, which keeps a cycle of vulnerability that just goes on and on. So, like, what do you think about that?
I feel like that's an unfortunate consequence of what I think a lot of people call the ivory tower argument, where because these governments and their policies are aligned, again, so much more strongly with those corporate interests, especially in the states where we have Citizens United, again,
Yes.
a lot harder for those voices in peril, valid voices in peril, to be heard and have their worries, woes, and problems effectively resolved and assisted by the government in that case. So I think that adverse handling there again circles back to corporate meddling in politics there and the adverse effect of corporate interests versus the interests of the constituents.
Right. Do you remember the show that released a few years ago, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier?
You, yes, wonderful show. John Walker.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, granted, this show is pure fiction.
But
Don't
still,
believe everything you. But in the last episode, it made an extremely valid point where when Sam Wilson, the Falcon, finally takes up the shields and defeats and in a case subdues the enemy, after the fight is over, he makes a valid point to to these people who are extremely high in power, where this girl was trying to overthrow them for a reason, but no one ever stopped to consider why this girl was trying to kill them or overthrow them. They only just saw the killing part of her plans. And then he went on to mention how in the room you're in right now, are you thinking about the people who are being affected by these policies that you make? Or are you thinking about the people who are in the room with you and how more of you yourself will be affected and how other people like you specifically will be affected instead of these other different people? Because we live in a large society, like 8 billion plus people, and everyone is in a different situation entirely. Granted, so it's hard to consider everyone, but you should at least try to consider the majority of the people, the larger marginalized groups, rather than people who are explicitly like you when making decisions.
right. I think that's an incredible point where some of the very valid pushback to those arguments on considering the needs of the constituents often comes down to some arguments like, oh, I earned so and so wealth through my efforts. Why do I have to share that in some way? Let's just say through government programs,
Yeah,
increasing tax, whatever. Why do I have to share that with uh, these people that are in lower classes economically? And I think there definitely is an argument to be made there about, supporting the interests of the greater country versus individual interests. And I think that largely comes down to the zeitgeist of the country and is a very hard decision to make. There is no right answer on whether the country should act as one body or if it should act as a venue for individuals to sow the fruits of their labor. So I think, well, I'm personally in support of the country acting as one. That's
yes.
my own opinion. The opinion that people that reap those rewards should be able to just take advantage of them, keep them in general, also entirely valid. In the climate sense,
Yes.
I think it's a little bit less justified in my opinion, just because it's not necessarily that these corporate interests are being fulfilled solely for the sake of profit, but also that with that profit comes legitimate detriment to the rest of the world in climate change and those consequences of air pollutants on newborns and expecting mothers you were talking about. So I feel like it's a little bit different when the downside of the upside on the personal level is on such a large elder scale worldwide, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. On top of that, I think like when we think about these people who are in this higher power, they also like, oh, they're also going in there saying like, oh, well, I'm not affected by this. Why should I care? But I like to think that the reason that you should care is that, like we've emphasized before, things in the climate are gradually getting worse. So although it may not affect you now, it may affect you later in your life, or it may also affect someone else that you care about in your life, which is also not a good thing. So instead of like trying to think about how it just only affects you, start thinking about like the people close to you, or think somewhat more in the long run. Although all my ideas are probably thinking of if we were in a utopian society, which I clearly understand we are not. The world is unfair. Issues will continue existing no matter how long we go, and that's our kind of yin and yang. We solve one problem, a new problem. I said that's just life. But it's better to come together as a community and help each other out sometimes more than not.
Right.
So what else?
That is a great point. I know there was a paper from, have you heard of Matthew Botvinnik?
No, I have not.
Matthew
I
Bot
please enlighten me.
Matthew Botvinnik is a researcher at Google DeepMind who was formerly a professor at Yale Law School. He mainly, in addition to AI ethics, also works in AI models to effectively model human agents. One of his papers recently, I want to say published in Science around like September, October-ish, revolved around modeling human agents and seeing if they reach a consensus when allowed to kind of deliberate for infinite generations. And what he found is that following an egalitarian policy, they kind of, what's the word for it? Converge to slightly, what's the word for it? Policies that end up having a net negative impact overall when compared to certain policies in a less egalitarian sense, which I think is interesting in opposition to the traditional thesis that an egalitarian approach equalizes benefit for all. So I think although there's an argument to be made for, like what I was saying, equalizing some of that wealth across, equalizing some of that policy, minimizing downside on the mass scale, there is definitely ongoing research which implies that for one reason or another, that might not be the answer, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. On top of that, I do believe on the public perception part of this entire thing that public perception does need an increase, especially because there are still a lot of people in this world who believe that climate change isn't real, which is unfortunate. And like, if they don't believe this, it's like, I guess, no offense to anyone, it's kind of like believing the earth is flat.
Very true.
Whereas it's already been proven multiple times before in the past that the earth is definitely not flat.
Mhm.
So part of me wants to believe that one solution that we could potentially have is to have some form of educational campaigns that maybe or maybe not mandatory should increase awareness of issues in our society right now, like climate change, especially how they're tailored to areas like underdeveloped or still developing regions in our world, which would be able to help a lot of people. On top of that, it's just like if we like how most of us how we've talked so far, we're talking about like the US as a nation itself, but like we haven't really talked about how it's more of an international emergency, I guess. And it's not only just an international emergency that may not be affecting that many people right now. It's intergenerational. Whereas time goes on, it'll get worse, it'll affect more people, and especially it'll affect the future. And I am someone who likes to believe in our future because our future, these new children being born, they've done nothing wrong to be in this situation themselves. they're just they're just being affected by consequences of generations before them. So personal, my own opinion is like try to help reduce these risks right now to make sure that they can strive towards a better future and solve their own issues instead of carry on our problems with them in the future.
Yes, I 100% agree. I think, yeah, I agree with everything there. I guess even in an ideal scenario in my head, I'm imagining, okay, we convince 100% of this current generation coming up as new leaders. But I think we still have that issue of corporate interests bleeding into government policy, and that there's some transition time or like, yeah, some transition time before we get
Yes.
even this ideal 100% convinced block of people into those positions. Do you think that even in that ideal scenario, that transition time is too late, that the effects of our climate change adverse policy in wake of corporate interests are too much, that we'll have passed a cutoff where there's such adverse consequence that we're kind of past the point of no return? Do you think that awareness of generations that are to be in those positions is effective, given that in the transitionary time, we will still see climate change adverse policy?
I like to give any generation the benefit of the doubt and to say that there there's definitely going to be sacrifices made along the journey, as always, without, I guess, from a movie I watched a few years ago in a trailer, there was a quote that said, maybe it's not from a movie, maybe that's just where I heard it personally, but it said, without sacrifice, there can be no victory whatsoever.
Right.
So what I like to read is that, yes, corporates will need to consider their profits, but they should be willing to take some form of profit cut to be able to help the people who will run their companies in the and corporations in the future.
So do you think
Because
that,
even
oh, sorry,
no, you go ahead.
do you think that in order to effectively combat climate change, we can wait for those generations with increased awareness to face into those corporate roles? Or do you think we have to somehow, some way, logistically, tackle those corporations head on and convince the existing executives directly? Because again, in the former case, there's some transitionary period, even a
Yes.
decade. That's an additional decade of emissions at the current levels, which are climate change adverse. Do you think it's possible or feasible, from what you've been looking into, to convince those corporate interests to the contrary?
What I've been looking into, there is a chance. There's always a chance into those corporations looking into this further. Granted, they may not like the idea, but I want to say that there is a chance. And even though it may take like a decade or so for any change to happen in these said corporations, like maybe I'm just getting your question wrong. I want to say you would need to attack them head on right now to at least get them start considering change.
Right. Oh,
Because it all
actually,
starts with their consideration.
one thing I'm thinking of, I guess is kind of like a complement slash dual to what you're saying with a potential solution, can awareness in these generations. I suppose a knock-on effect of that increased awareness is that, let's just say in government elections, which of course are on a much smaller time scale, not generational, but maybe
Yes.
yearly, bi-yearly, whatever.
Hmm.
I suppose shifts in elected officials and their respective policy and how they reflect those newly aware constituents could also be effective because of that duality, or sorry, not duality, that interplay between corporate interests and government interests, and how, although corporate interests influence the government through lobbying, with
Yes.
stalwart enough officials and policymakers, it can also go the other way around. So that's actually a great point you make.
Yeah. Especially with like sometimes governments do put corporations in their area first. A lot of times corporates also have to put their government first. So in a way, everything is interconnected. And
Right,
it's better to start somewhere. It could be anywhere, but it's better to start somewhere, which
right,
is definitely better than just not starting at all.
right. I feel like, regardless of what we do, any of the solutions
Yeah.
we're proposing, I feel like, to make an analogy to Fortnite, once the storm closes in on those corporations, once they start feeling the effects of climate change tangibly, I'm I hope they'll change course.
Yes.
Because again,
Well, we made
climate
a lot.
affects everyone.
Go. Yeah. It affects everyone in some way, shape, or form, whether we like it or not.
Precisely, unfortunately. Haha.
Well, we made a lot of good arguments in the past. Who knows how long we've been talking for? All
Indeed.
right. Thank you for joining me with this. It was a
Yes.
pleasure having you here.
And pleasure talking to you, Sakshan.
Thank you.
Cheerio.